Welcome to another video. This one is going to be about positive reinforcement and how it can be applied in Overwatch. Positive reinforcement is when you reward a behavior with stimuli or stimulus, if you want to use that word, that cues a person to perform a learned behavior. The learned behavior it strengthens the behavior in the future, which means that a person is more inclined to perform it more frequently. It can last for longer period of time, and it can be to a greater extent, or like that. And if we want to look at it in Overwatch, if you imagine that you're scrimming and you're with your team, you're running some arbitrary comp, doesn't really matter which one, but the enemy, they pull up a counter. And just imagine any comp. Let's say that they're playing, or let's say that you're playing Orisa, Roadhog with Widow and D.Va or something, and the enemy pulls out double sniper on King's Row, and they're attacking, of course. You then lose the first team fight. Let's say you lose it super quick, and there's no ult charges to be kept. The team starts panicking because it was lost so quickly, it was so uneven. You don't really have anything to snowball with, or to stop the snowball with on the second phase. So you make a quick decision, and it's while everyone is respawning as well. So you make a quick decision to swap to a counter, and it doesn't matter what the actual counter is. Just imagine that you're countering their double sniper. The next fight goes extremely well for you, and you deal with everything the enemy has to put against you. You hold the choke by the arch, in second phase early on, and you hear your teammates saying good job with the swap, so good job with the idea, and they become zoned in again, and the scrim goes as planned, basically. That's positive reinforcement from your teammates, and it might not be easy to recognize it in the moment, because when you think of positive reinforcement, you might think that it's these more obvious cases where you say that something was good, but in this case it was something subtle. It was just a positive response from your teammates that gave you like a good feeling. And what this did in the thought experiment is that it makes you more inclined to take that leadership position, or make that call, or be the one that solve these types of problems in the future. And it's usually also going to be more when you're respawning. It depends on which situation you were in as well. But yeah, what I meant is that because they say it's good job, and they give you a good feeling after whatever action it was, that's strengthening your behavior, basically, and you're more likely to pull it out again because you want that feedback again, of course. If we then take a second example, just to show how else it can look like. Imagine that you're a coach, and this time you're watching a VOD with a player 1-on-1. You have some note about a situation where the player makes a wrong switch, but they don't acknowledge it in game. So they don't know what went wrong, or they don't know why it went wrong, and so on. And no one else in the team has brought it up either. Maybe they didn't know that it was bad. Maybe they didn't want to take the confrontation, to give the player feedback. Maybe they're afraid of bringing it up, etc. It doesn't matter which cause it is, but no one else brought it up. And just to make it simple, let's say that the player switched to Tracer and the enemy has a Brigitte. You present the situation to the player, and you try to get their point of view, and you ask something such as, how come you switched to Tracer? That's like a neutral question, opens up the door for the player to explain, to give their point of view, to explain their logic, etc. Let's say that the player doesn't know why it was a bad switch. It can be that they have never played Tracer versus Brigitte. or whatever. And so when you see the logic, you might see a few missing gaps of information. Let's say that the player isn't aware of how lethal a stun is, for example, or is reckless about their positioning versus a Brigitte, etc. You fill in them with information, you give them your logic about why Tracer didn't work, and you do it in a neutral way, and then you tell the player, or you tell the player basically what counted them and why it counted them. And then you ask them, what would you have switched to instead, now that you know this? And it's sort of like a confirmation to see if they learned something. If the player then tells you that they picked something else, that they would pick something else, and we can imagine that they would pick Sombra or Widow or Doomfist or Pharaoh, whatever, you know, depends on the situation, of course, but something else that isn't as hard countered. And assuming if the map is okay for it, and you say, okay, that's a good switch, that's perfect, that's a form of positive reinforcement as well. And it helps the player learn, or not help, but it activates a learning behavior, because the player sees, aha, I learned this about the Tracer, and for this reason, and this logic means that any squishy with close range combat is gonna get punished really easy by a Brigitte, for example. And that inclines the player to think more about the switches they make, and also why they make the switches and why something doesn't work and so on. In both examples, the player that has a behavior strengthened by the positive stimulus, the player that has a behavior strengthened will be more likely to repeat it, as I mentioned, and maybe I'm just repeating it too much, but keep in mind that even though this is something that you can use to repeat behaviors and so on, like positive behaviors, it's also applied for negative behaviors. For example, or not negative, but let's start with the positive behaviors when you don't really notice it at all. For example, hitting headshots is an addictive feeling. For example, if you're on McCree and you're hitting headshot, 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 like triple headshot in a row, it's a very satisfying feeling. And it's because of the sound, you know, the dink. That's a form of positive reinforcement. It reinforces the behavior to hit headshots, basically. But when it happens, let's take a bad positive reinforcement behavior, or like a bad behavior to positively reinforce. For example, imagine that a player is stressed during scrims, might be tilt or whatever, and they're ventilating on their teammates, and there's no repercussion, nothing bad said against them, no player says anything against them, and they basically get to feel good for, you know, taking out something else, like stress, on their teammate, even though the teammate doesn't deserve it or shouldn't even receive it, because they have this satisfying feeling of letting go of the stress. That in itself is a type of positive reinforcement, because they get a good feeling from letting it out without any repercussions at all. And yeah, it's something that you can deal with through a concept called negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement is often mistaken for punishment, which it isn't. But yeah, I'll talk more about negative reinforcement in my next video. Hopefully this basic intro to positive reinforcement brought some light to why so many people recommend using positive reinforcement, why it's repeated so often in social media, interviews and so on, that positive reinforcement is the key. Use more positive reinforcement and so on. But sometimes it's hard to understand what positive reinforcement is and how it can be applied to Overwatch.